For 2 years, Ford spent millions trying to beat Ferrari at Le Mans, but the GT40 was a disaster. It overheated, the gearbox shattered, and the brakes failed after 3 hours. In 1964 and 1965, not a single Ford finished the race. Ferrari laughed while Ford executives panicked. The engineers in Detroit couldn't solve it. But then, Carroll Shelby, the Texas racing legend Ford had hired to save the program, brought in his secret weapon. A British mechanic with grease under his fingernails who understood what the factory engineers didn't. Ken Miles didn't just drive the car, he rebuilt it from the suspension up, solving problems no one else could see. His modifications turned a failure into the fastest endurance car on Earth. But when 1966 came around and the checkered flag finally fell at Le Mans, Miles would learn that beating Ferrari wasn't enough. 1963. Henry Ford II had just been humiliated. He'd flown to Italy with a briefcase full of cash, ready to buy Ferrari and dominate European racing. The deal was done. Champagne was on ice. Then Enzo Ferrari walked out, calling Ford a manufacturer of ugly little cars in ugly factories. The insult burned. Ford didn't just want revenge. He wanted to crush Ferrari at the one place that mattered most, Le Mans, the 24-hour endurance race that separated legends from pretenders. Ford threw millions at the problem. They hired the best engineers from Detroit, built the GT40 with a massive 427 cubic inch V8 and shipped it to France in 1964. It was fast, brutally fast. But speed meant nothing if the car couldn't survive. The GT40S didn't just lose, they disintegrated. Gearboxes exploded after 3 hours, brakes overheated and failed, engines seized. Not a single Ford finished the race, while Ferrari cruised to another victory. The engineers in Dearborn studied the wreckage and made adjustments. Better cooling, stronger transmissions, reinforced suspension. They returned to Le Mans in 1965 with the same result: total failure. Ferrari won again. The problem wasn't the parts, it was the system. Detroit's engineers built cars on paper, in wind tunnels, on test tracks. But Le Mans was chaos. Speeds over 200 miles per hour on straights, then hard braking into tight corners. 24 hours of punishment with no mercy for weakness. The GT40 needed someone who understood racing, not as theory, but as survival. Enter Ken Miles, a 47-year-old British mechanic who'd spent World War II as a tank commander on the beaches of Normandy. After the war, he'd moved to California and built a reputation in the underground racing scene, not as a celebrity driver, but as the guy who could take a broken MG, rebuild it in his garage, and win races against factory teams. Carroll Shelby hired him because Miles had something Detroit's engineers didn't. He could feel what a car needed before it broke. But Miles had a problem. He was blunt, abrasive, and had zero patience for corporate politics. Ford executives hated him. April 1965. Shelby American's workshop in Los Angeles. Ken Miles climbs out of the GT40 after another test session at Riverside. The car sits steaming on the tarmac, brake rotors glowing orange. He walks to the engineering team holding clipboards and data sheets. "The brakes are cooked," Miles says. 3 laps at race pace and they're gone. The lead engineer checks his numbers. The cooling ducts are sized correctly. The calipers are rated for... "I don't care what they're rated for," Miles cuts him off. "At 200 miles per hour down the Mulsanne Straight, you hit the brakes and there's nothing. The pedal goes to the floor. You're a passenger in a missile." The problem wasn't just the brakes, it was everything. The gearbox was a grenade. At Le Mans, drivers shifted hundreds of times per lap under brutal load. The GT40's transmission, borrowed from a road car and reinforced with thicker gears, would last maybe 4 hours before the synchros shredded and the gears welded themselves together. Ford's solution was to make the gears even thicker, heavier. Miles tested it and came back shaking his head. Now it won't shift at all. The cooling system was worse. The 427 engine produced over 480 horsepower, which meant it also produced enough heat to boil water in seconds. Ford's engineers had calculated the radiator size based on airflow at cruising speed. But Le Mans wasn't cruising. It was full throttle, then hard braking, then crawling through traffic, then full throttle again. The temperature gauge would spike into the red, steam would pour from the overflow, the engine would seize. Add a bigger radiator, the engineers said. Miles tested it. The extra weight made the car slower. The added frontal area created drag. They'd solved the cooling problem by making the car uncompetitive. Then there was the suspension. At 200 miles per hour, the GT40 developed aerodynamic lift. The nose would rise, the steering would go light, the car would float, disconnected from the road, until a gust of wind or a bump sent it spinning into the barriers. Ford's wind tunnel data said the car was stable. The crash reports said otherwise. Every solution created a new problem. Stiffen the suspension to reduce body roll and the car would skip over bumps, losing traction. Soften it and the car would wallow through corners, scrubbing speed. Add downforce with a rear wing and the drag would kill top speed on the straights. Detroit's engineers kept building fixes based on theory. Miles kept bringing back broken cars and data that contradicted the computers. "You're asking the car to do two opposite things," Miles told them. "Be stable at 200 and nimble at 60. You can't engineer that with a slide rule." But Miles wasn't working with slide rules. He was working with instinct, grease, and 20 years of keeping broken cars alive long enough to win. Miles didn't wait for permission. He started with the brakes. The problem was heat dissipation. At racing speeds, the rotors absorbed so much energy they'd glow red, then fade to nothing. Ford's engineers wanted bigger rotors, thicker pads, more cooling ducts. Miles had a different idea. If the brakes were going to cook anyway, make them replaceable. Fast. He designed a quick change system. The entire brake assembly, rotor, caliper, pads, could be swapped in under 2 minutes during a pit stop. Instead of nursing dying brakes for 24 hours, they'd run them hard and replace them. The engineers hated it. "That's admitting defeat," one said. Miles shrugged. "It's admitting physics." They tested it at Riverside. The brakes lasted 3 hours at race pace, then got swapped. The car kept going. But the gearbox was still a problem. The transmission was destroying itself because drivers were forcing shifts under load. Miles studied the shift pattern, the engine's power curve, the exact RPM where torque peaked. He realised the problem wasn't the gears, it was the timing. He taught the drivers to lift off the throttle for a fraction of a second during shifts, unloading the transmission just enough to let the synchros engage smoothly. "You're asking them to go slower," an engineer said. "I'm asking them to finish," Miles replied. It worked. The gearbox survived. But now the cooling system was failing in a new way. The oil temperature would spike during hard cornering, not on the straights. Miles crawled under the car and found the problem. The oil pickup was in the wrong place. During high G turns, the oil would slosh away from the pickup, starving the engine. He relocated it. Simple fix. 2 hours with a welder. The car was getting better, but Ford executives were getting nervous. Miles was too outspoken, too British, too rough around the edges. They wanted a clean-cut American hero for the cameras. Miles didn't care. He had a race to win. February 1966, Daytona 24 hours. Miles and Lloyd Ruby took the GT40 to the grid. The Ferrari team watched from across the pit lane. For 24 hours, Miles drove like a man possessed. Smooth, precise, relentless. When the checkered flag fell, the GT40 had won. Ford's first major endurance victory. The executives celebrated. Miles went back to work. Next was Sebring. March 1966. 12 hours of punishment on a bumpy airfield circuit. Miles was leading comfortably when Ford's race director radioed an order. "Back off. Preserve the car. We've got this." Miles ignored him. He kept pushing. Another Ford GT40, driven by different drivers, was closing in. Then, with an hour to go, that car's engine failed. Miles inherited an even bigger lead. He crossed the line first. In the pits, Ford executives were furious. Miles had disobeyed a direct order. Carroll Shelby pulled him aside. "You can't keep doing this. They're looking for a reason to replace you." Miles stared at him. "I'm here to win races, not follow orders that don't make sense." But the tension was building. Miles had won Daytona. He'd won Sebring. If he won Le Mans in June, he'd achieve the Triple Crown, something no driver in history had ever done. The car was ready. Miles was ready. But Ford had other priorities. June 18th, 1966, Le Mans. The GT40s lined up on the grid. Miles qualified second. The race began with the traditional Le Mans start, drivers sprinting across the track to their cars. Miles jumped in, slammed the door, and took off. But something was wrong. The door wouldn't latch. It had closed over the aerodynamic flange instead of under it. He had to complete the first lap with the door flapping open, then pit to fix it. He lost a full lap. Last place. Most drivers would have given up. Miles didn't. He drove the next 23 hours like a man on fire. Lap after lap, he clawed his way back through the field. By midnight, he was in the top 10. By dawn, he was in the top 5. By noon, he was leading. The Ferrari team watched their cars break down one by one. Overheating, transmission failures, electrical problems. By the final hours, all the Ferraris were out. Ford had 3 GT40s running in first, second and third. Miles was leading by 4 laps. The Triple Crown was his. Then, with 2 hours to go, Ford's executives made a decision. They wanted a photo finish. All 3 cars crossing the line together, a perfect image for the press. They radioed Miles. "Slow down, let the others catch up." Miles couldn't believe what he was hearing. He'd led for 24 hours. He'd driven the perfect race. And now they wanted him to throw it away for a photograph. Carroll Shelby got on the radio. "Ken, please, just do it." Miles slowed down. The 3 GT40s crossed the finish line side by side. The crowd erupted. Ford had crushed Ferrari. But in the chaos of celebration, race officials huddled over the rulebook. If cars finish together, the winner is determined by who started further back on the grid. Bruce McLaren's car had qualified 8th. Miles had qualified 2nd. McLaren had covered more total distance. The announcement came over the loudspeakers. Bruce McLaren and Chris Amon, official winners of the 1966 24 Hours of Le Mans. Miles stood on the podium, second place, watching McLaren spray champagne. He'd led the race for 24 hours. He'd driven from last to first. He'd been 4 laps ahead. The Triple Crown, Daytona, Sebring, Le Mans in 1 year, had been in his hands. Ford had taken it away for a photograph. When reporters asked him about it, Miles kept his composure. "I work for these people. They've been good to me." But those who knew him saw the truth. Something had broken. 2 months later, August 17th, 1966, Miles was back at Riverside testing Ford's next weapon, the J car. Lighter, faster, more advanced than the GT40. He'd spent the morning pushing it to its limits, over 200 miles per hour down the back straight. Then, without warning, the car lifted. The aerodynamics failed. It flipped, tumbled, and disintegrated. Miles was thrown from the cockpit. He died instantly. Ford issued a brief statement. Carroll Shelby wept. The racing world mourned. But the executives in Detroit moved on quickly. There were more races to win, more cars to build. Miles became a footnote in Ford's official history, the test driver who helped develop the GT40. But the car that won Le Mans in 1967, 1968 and 1969 was Ken Miles's car. Every modification, every solution, every innovation that made the GT40 dominant came from his hands. The quick change brake system, the revised cooling ducts, the suspension geometry, the shift technique that saved the gearbox. Ford kept winning because Miles had solved the problems no one else could see. The engineers in Detroit never understood what they'd lost. They had the data, the wind tunnel results, the computer models, but they didn't have the man who could feel a problem through the steering wheel, who could hear a failing bearing over the roar of the engine, who could translate instinct into engineering. For decades, Miles remained forgotten outside racing circles. Ford celebrated the GT40 as an American triumph. Ferrari remembered 1966 as the year they were humiliated. But Ken Miles, the British mechanic who made it all possible, disappeared from the story. It wasn't until 2019, when Ford versus Ferrari brought his story to the screen, that the world finally learned his name. Millions watched Christian Bale portray the stubborn genius who beat Ferrari but was never allowed to win. The film didn't just resurrect a forgotten hero, it exposed a truth about innovation that corporations have always tried to hide. Progress doesn't come from boardrooms or computer models. It comes from the people in the workshop, covered in grease, solving problems that the experts say are impossible. Miles represented something dangerous to institutional thinking. The idea that feel matters as much as data, that experience trumps theory, that the best solutions come from the people closest to the problem. Every modern racing program has a Ken Miles now, the test driver who bridges the gap between engineering and reality, the one who can tell you what the data can't. Ford learned that lesson the hard way. They had the greatest driver engineer in the world, and they threw him away for a photograph. Ken Miles beat Ferrari. He saved Ford. He revolutionized endurance racing. But when the checkered flag fell, they made sure his name wasn't on the trophy. The car that won was his. The victory belonged to someone else. And 2 months later, he was gone.